Texas continues to reel from a devastating downpour and deadly flooding over the July 4th weekend. Heavy rain dumped on the central part of the state, causing the Guadalupe River to rise 26 feet in 45 minutes. At least 108 people have been killed, 28 of them are children.
And the political finger-pointing started almost immediately, with some Democrats calling out DOGE cuts as the culprit. But our next guest says that initial assessments of what went wrong are being taken out of context. It's a natural disaster, not necessarily a policy disaster. And factors other than short staffing at the National Weather Service are what played a role in this tragic event. Joining us now to elaborate is Reason reporter Christian Britschgi. Welcome back to Rising.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, great to be with you. And you wrote a really good article about this. And, you know, while I'm broadly supportive of the DOGE cuts, I keep an open mind. It's, of course, possible that this is something we should have been spending more money on, the National Weather Service, or we need more staff, and that, you know, cutting it in some way did lead to this absolute catastrophe. But you've looked at some of the evidence, and you are determining that it seems like that's not really what was going on. Can you say more?
Yeah, sure. So people in the immediate aftermath of the floods did point to the fact that as part of these various DOGE initiatives, a few hundred meteorologists at the National Weather Service have taken early retirement or been let go, and that there are several vacancies that included someone in the Central Texas, offices of National Weather Service. And then also the National Weather Service had a few open positions in the relevant areas of Texas where these floods occurred. Cutting against this idea that short staffing led to delayed or inadequate warnings about the Texas floods is, firstly, the National Weather Service itself has said we were not short staffed in the run up to this disaster. So normally they would have two meteorologists on staff at a given time. In the lead up to these floods, they had 5. That's coming from the National Weather Service itself. And then also, independent meteorologists based in Texas have also looked at the timeline of National Weather Service warnings and said, this looks normal, adequate, what we would be expecting NWS to do. So these floods occurred in the wee hours of, Saturday morning, Friday night. On Thursday, the National Weather Service had issued a flood warning. They'd upgraded that later in the day on Friday. And then within, an hour before the most severe flash flooding, they issued an emergency alert saying, get to higher ground now. Unfortunately, these warnings were coming in at like 4 a.m. when the most severe flash flooding started at 5. So many people were likely asleep. There's questions about, and therefore didn't see warnings or text warnings on their phones. There's questions about whether local authorities did enough to translate, the warnings they were receiving from NWS to local people on the ground, to people in harm's way. But this notion that it was federal cuts to NWS that had any impact on their operations here, there hasn't been any evidence produced to show that.
I have seen it also suggested, Christian, this actually gets at one of the points that you just raised. You talked about there have been questions about whether the local authorities did everything they could or coordinated as well as they could with the federal NWS. What do we think about that? Do we think that there is validity to that criticism?
It's still so early after the initial event that I don't think we can say definitively. I will say there was a delay from when these NWS warnings were going out, and then when local disaster management organizations, local governments, police departments were posting on social media or sending out their own warnings. Oftentimes, in a few cases, those warnings seem to be coming out after the flash flooding had already started, when they were posting on Facebook to seek higher ground, what have you. But again, it's difficult to say because this was happening at 5 a.m, 4 a.m. So if those warnings had been more prompt, would people have even seen them? Would the private people in harm's way have actually been able to respond? I think that's kind of an open question. So I don't know if we can say definitively at the moment whether it really was just whether a local incompetence was a major factor here, or whether they themselves were generally acting adequately.
I mean, what kind of format do these warnings even take? I could be way off base here, but like if I get another notification on my phone that there's a missing child, or that there's some kind of danger, I might just ignore it because I feel we're over alerted to everything these days. Is anything of that going on that it wouldn't be believed, or it would just be chalked up to, oh, it's bad weather. We get storm warnings all the time. We just don't take them as seriously maybe as we should in an example of a like once in a century perhaps catastrophe as this was.
Right. And so this is something that meteorologists have pointed out too in response to the weekend's flooding, which is this is a flood prone area. And so people are receiving constant warnings about floods. And it's, there's always an element of chance. You can't do it with 100% precision to be able to predict whether you're going to have, so much rain, how much rain is going to fall in this particular area, exactly how much flooding is it going to cause. And so then that gives this question of, well, when do you send out warnings? What level of warning do you send? Because obviously, as I mentioned in my article too, and as Robbie, you mentioned, the more warnings that you send out as maybe a precautionary principle, well, that can very easily backfire because then people start to ignore them the more that they don't actually translate. For instance, in Washington, D.C. yesterday, we had some rain, but when I opened my weather app, it did say there's flash flood warning. I very promptly ignored that because I'm like, well, it said that many times, and I've never seen, some sort of flash flood in the middle of the city. And so, I discounted that warning. And so in a flood prone area where you're also getting these warnings all the time, I think it is kind of hard to add, when you notify people, how often, and how do you get the public to take those warnings seriously on top of this problem of that people were, again, asleep in the early in the morning. I think that's a really difficult problem to solve.
Obviously, Christian, your story is digging into the details of the Texas tragedy and doing so very well. But just on the bigger picture, as I understand it, the total staffing losses at the NWS are about 550 people. There were probationary workers who were laid off. Then there were other people who chose to leave because I think they felt the atmosphere from the federal government, the Trump administration, was rather hostile to them.
And they're experts on atmosphere.
Yes, well, indeed. But anyway, I'll ignore Robbie's interruptions in the middle of all these things. Do you think that, is it questionable at a time when there are more extreme weather events, would you accept some legitimacy to questioning whether it is wise to let the National Weather Service suffer that level of staffing cuts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a completely reasonable point to raise. I think you can draw two, I guess, conclusions from the minimal impact that Doge had on these most recent Texas floods to speak that question of whether we should be cutting meteorologists or not. So on the one hand, you could say, well, hey, look, we fired a bunch of meteorologists and they were still able to do their job in the context of a sudden, very rare, very rare intensity storm. So maybe there was some fat that we could have cut this agency. It's actually good that we've slimmed down the staff that they have. It's not having an effect on operations. On the flip side, you could also argue that, well, thank God that this local branch was staffed adequately, but that might not be the case in the future. In a future disaster where actually maybe some places are more short-staffed and won't have the people that they need to be able to issue these timely warnings. I think you could draw either conclusion from this particular event. Certainly, the meteorologists who commented on NWS's performance, they're worried about cuts. I think even people who are generally pretty sympathetic to the idea that we should have the federal government do fewer things is okay with the National Weather Service. There's more technical arguments about how you might privatize that, but it would certainly be bad to reduce the capacity of your federalized national weather service without having some plan for what would replace that, given the value of this. So yeah, I think that's a reasonable concern that do they have enough staff or not? That's something people should obviously be concerned about.
Thank you very much, Christian Britschgi of Reason Magazine. Always great to see you.
Great, thank you guys.
Up next, JD Vance skewers Zohran Mamdani. Stay with us.